Y'all need to see this!
Out of my kitchen!
Coffee for you folks? That's for a regular.
They scanned the region for 6 months and called it the softest target on the continent. No power grid, no radio chatter, no visible weapon signatures, just fields, horses, and buildings made of wood. What their sensors could not measure was 300 years of knowing exactly how to raise a barn in one day, and exactly what you could build if you had a reason to build it bigger. If you like watching overconfident empires learn the hard way, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what you'd build first if the lights went out tomorrow. Now let's get into it, because the Skren Combine is about to find out what happens when you invade a community that never stopped knowing how to work with its hands. 400 light-years out, aboard a survey cruiser shaped like a folded blade, Overseer Thalen Vex reviewed the scan results a third time, mostly because the first 2 readings seemed impossible. "Confirm this," Vex said. "No electrical grid across the entire settlement zone." His scanning officer, a narrow gray-skinned analyst named Core, checked the data again. "Confirmed, Overseer. 0 grid infrastructure, 0 radio emissions, 0 powered vehicles detected in a 40-kilometer radius. And weapons signatures. None detected. Sensors register only edged agricultural tools and livestock." Vex allowed himself something close to satisfaction. The Combine had spent 11 cycles subjugating worlds with orbital defense grids, plasma net shielding, and populations who fought back with things that could actually hurt you. This region, rolling farmland in the human territory designated Pennsylvania, registered as the single softest population center on the entire continent. No power meant no early warning. No radio meant no coordination. It looked, by every metric the Combine trusted, like a conquest that would take an afternoon. What the scan could not register was 300 years of a community that had never depended on any of those things in the first place. "Log it as priority target," Vex said. "We land at first light." Beside him, a junior tactical officer named Dresch studied the terrain map with a faint frown. "Overseer, there is an adjacent settlement zone approximately 11 kilometers east. Mixed technology signature. Standard power grid, vehicle traffic, radio and cellular emissions." "Irrelevant," Vex said. "We are targeting the primary zone first. The secondary population can be addressed after." Dresch said nothing further, though the frown did not entirely leave his face. It would be recorded much later as one of several small warnings that had been noted and then dismissed before the Combine ever set foot on the ground. The Yoder farm, just outside a small community called Bird in Hand, had been quiet since before dawn, the way it always was on a Thursday in late spring. Elam Yoder was already out checking the fence line when the sky did something it had never done before. It didn't streak. It didn't burn. It came down slow and deliberate, a dark shape easing itself onto the far pasture like something that had done this 100 times on 100 other worlds. Elam stood at the fence for a long moment, hat pushed back, watching it settle into the grass without so much as flattening the fence line beside it. He did not run. He did not call anyone because there was no one to call. He walked back to the house, put the coffee on, and told his wife Miriam there was something big sitting in the low pasture that hadn't been there an hour ago. "Big how?" Miriam asked. "Big like a barn," Elam said. "Bigger." By the time the sun was fully up, half the neighboring farms had heard, not through any signal or wire, but the way news had always traveled in that valley, a boy sent running down the lane, a lantern hung at a gate, a bell rung twice instead of once. Within the hour, a dozen men stood at the fence line studying the ship the way they might study a fallen tree blocking a road. A problem, not a catastrophe, and certainly not a reason to panic. Bishop Amos Stoltzfus arrived last, walking slow with his cane, and looked at the thing sitting in Elam's pasture for a long moment before he spoke. "Well," he said, "that's new." Behind him, a teenager named Sadie Fisher stood at the edge of the gathered crowd with her bicycle propped against the fence post, staring at the ship with an expression that was less fear and more calculation. Sadie was 17, and in the middle of her Rumspringa, which meant she had a phone in her coat pocket that most of the men standing at that fence didn't know about, and a cousin 2 farms over who worked part-time at the hardware store in town and had a truck. She said nothing yet. She simply took out the phone, angled it carefully so nobody would notice, and took 3 photographs. The Combine's first landing party emerged an hour later. 6 soldiers in matte gray armor, weapons slung but visible, moving in the tight disciple. Ined formation of a species that had done this on 11 other worlds and expected it to go the same way here. Their translator drone activated as they approached the gathered men at the fence. Inhabitants of this territory, you are now under the jurisdiction of the Skren Combine. Remain calm and you will not be harmed. Nobody at the fence moved. Nobody ran. A few of the younger men exchanged glances, but the older men simply kept watching, the same patient, unhurried attention they gave a storm cloud building on the horizon worth noting, not worth panicking over. Bishop Stoltzfus stepped forward, leaning on his cane. You're standing in Elam's corn. The lead soldier's translator processed this. Repeat. The corn, Amos said, pointing with the cane. You're standing in it. It was planted 3 weeks ago. The soldier looked down at his own boots, planted squarely in a neat row of new green shoots, and then back up, clearly uncertain how to file this observation into any conquest protocol he had trained for. We are not concerned with your agriculture, the soldier said. You will comply with Combine authority. We heard you the first time, Amos said. I'm asking you to move your boots. The soldier did not move his boots. This would later be noted by exactly 1 member of that landing party as the first small mistake of the entire operation. Sir, said the soldier standing to his left, a younger trooper whose translator badge read as Kess, the elder is not exhibiting fear response. None of them are, the lead soldier muttered. Elam Yoder, standing a few feet from the bishop, folded his arms and studied the 6 of them the way he might study a fox that had wandered too close to the henhouse in daylight, not dangerous yet, but worth watching closely. You're not from around here, he said. It wasn't a question. We are the vanguard of the Skren Combine, the lead soldier announced, drawing himself up. This territory is claimed under expansion Writ 4471. You will offer no resistance. Nobody's resisting anything, Amos said. We're asking you kindly to step off the corn, and we'd appreciate knowing your intentions before this goes any further. The lead soldier's translator flagged the phrase step off the corn as a possible idiom, cross-referenced it against nothing useful, and returned no result. He held his ground. His boots stayed exactly where they were. Miriam Yoder, watching from the porch with a dish towel still in her hands, turned to her daughter and said quietly, Go tell your Uncle Jonas. Tell him to bring the wagon. Overseer Vex, watching the feed from orbit, was becoming quietly frustrated by a population that was refusing to perform either of the 2 reactions his training predicted, terror or immediate armed resistance. Instead, the humans below were doing something his threat models had no category for. They were mildly inconvenienced. Status, Vex said. No hostile action taken, Overseer, Core reported. The local population is observing. Several have asked the landing team to relocate. Relocate. Away from planted crops, Overseer. Vex stared at the report for several seconds. Continue establishing perimeter. Deploy the 2nd team to the settlement center. I want a show of presence before midday. Dresch, still monitoring the terrain map, spoke up again. Overseer, thermal and audio pickups indicate movement across multiple properties. Foot traffic, wagon traffic, and what appears to be organized group activity at several sites simultaneously. Define organized. Unclear, overseer. The activity does not match any known military mobilization pattern. It more closely resembles agricultural labor. Vex considered this for a moment and dismissed it. Agricultural labor, by definition, did not concern him. What Vex did not yet understand, what none of the Combine's 11 prior conquests had prepared him to understand, was that a community built entirely around cooperative labor, communal decision-making, and centuries of practice raising massive wooden structures in a single coordinated day was, without ever calling itself one of the most efficient rapid construction workforces on the entire planet. And word was already moving down the valley the old way, gate to gate, lantern to lantern, faster than any Combine sensor could track, because it wasn't traveling on any frequency they were built to detect. By midday, 60 men had gathered at the Yoder farm, not because anyone had summoned an army, because a barn raising had been called, and in this valley, when word went out that hands were needed, hands came. Except this time, nobody was raising a barn. Bishop Stoltzfus stood at the center of the gathered crowd beside a stack of fresh-cut lumber that had appeared, as if from nowhere over the course of the last 2 hours, hauled in by wagon from 3 separate mills, because word had reached the mills too. They're sitting in a valley with one road in, sigh. D. Jonas Baylor, who ran the sawmill 2 farms over and had spent the morning listening more than talking. One road in means one road matters. They've got machines that fly, said a younger man near the back. What good does a road do against something that flies? The ship flies, Jonas said. The soldiers walk. I watch them walk in from the pasture same as anybody, 2 legs same as us. Amos nodded slowly, working it over the way he worked over a difficult verse before Sunday service. Then we don't need to stop what flies. We need to stop what walks, and we need somewhere for what walks to have a very bad afternoon. Nobody in that crowd had ever built a war machine, but every man standing in that field had, at some point in his life, helped raise a barn frame 60 feet long in under 12 hours using nothing but joined timber, block and tackle, and 40 men who all knew exactly where to stand and exactly when to pull. The 2 problems, it turned out, required almost exactly the same skills. Off to one side, Sadie Fisher had found her cousin Dan, the one with the hardware store job and the truck, waiting at the end of the lane exactly where she'd told him to be. Dan looked at the ship in the distance, looked at the 60 men hauling lumber, and looked back at Sadie. "You want me to drive to town and tell who, exactly?" Dan asked. "The sheriff's not going to believe a spaceship landed in Elam Yoder's corn." "Not the sheriff," Sadie said. "Go to the hardware store. Tell your dad we need every roll of chain, every pulley block, and every length of rope in the place. Tell him we're paying cash and we're paying double." Dan looked at her for a long moment. "You're serious?" "Dan," Sadie said, "there is a spaceship in Elam Yoder's corn." Dan got in the truck. What went up over the next 6 hours did not look like a fortress. It looked, from a distance, like an unusually large and unusually fast barn raising, which was more or less exactly what it was. Teams that normally raised roof trusses instead raised a line of angled timber barriers along the single road into the valley. Walls built at a slant, the same bracing techniques used on every barn roof in the county, strong enough to stop a wagon, and as it turned out, strong enough to stop considerably more than a wagon. A crew that usually built hay wagons built something else entirely. Long wooden frames on iron-shod wheels, each one rigged with a counterweighted throwing arm salvaged from grain hoist designs that had been used in that valley for over a century. Nobody called them catapults. Amos called them extended reach equipment, and nobody argued with him, mostly because everyone was too busy working to argue about names. Elam Yoder, whose corn had started the whole affair, spent the afternoon overseeing the construction of a gate, a genuinely massive wooden gate, built using the same mortise and tenon joinery that had held his grandfather's barn together for 90 years without a single metal fastener, set up to funnel anything walking down that one road into a space precisely as wide as 3 men could effectively defend with pitchforks and patience. "This is a lot of wood for one afternoon," said a young man named Levi, hauling another beam into place. "We've built bigger," Jonas said, "in less time. We just usually don't have this good a reason." By mid-afternoon, Dan's truck came rattling up the lane loaded down with rope, pulley blocks, and enough chain to anchor a barge, his father Reuben Fisher riding in the passenger seat with his own toolbox on his lap. "Sadie called it a barn raising," Reuben said, climbing out and surveying the scene, the timber walls, the throwing arms, the gate rising at the mouth of the road. "This isn't a barn raising." "No," Amos agreed, "but it uses the same hands." Reuben, who was English, not Amish, a neighbor from town who'd sold lumber and hardware to half these families for 20 years, looked at the ship sitting in the pasture, looked at the 60-some men working in near total silence and total coordination, and rolled up his sleeves. "Where do you want the chain?" he said. It was, in its own quiet way, the first alliance the valley had formed that day, and it would not be the last. The Combine's second landing team, 20 soldiers strong, reached the settlement center, a small crossroads with a general store, a schoolhouse, and a scattering of farmhouses, a little after 2 in the afternoon, expecting an undefended civilian population. What they found instead was the schoolhouse empty, the general store locked and dark, and not a single human being anywhere in sight. "Report," the team leader said into his comm. "No contacts, Commander," came the reply from the scout ranging ahead. "Structures appear recently vacated. No resistance encountered." The team leader, an officer named Ralt, surveyed the empty crossroads with a mixture of suspicion and relief. Empty was easier than resistance. Emp. Tie could be logged as a successful pacification with minimal effort. What Ralt did not know, and what his sensors had no way of detecting, was that every family in that crossroads had done exactly what generations before them had done in every genuine emergency the valley had ever faced. They had gathered the children, gathered what mattered most, and moved to the nearest large barn where they could shelter together, watch the road, and wait to see what the men decided needed doing. The schoolhouse teacher, a young woman named Ruth Zook, had marched all 19 of her students the 1.5 miles to the Baylor barn without a single one of them crying or complaining, mostly because she had told them it was a very serious kind of field trip and promised whoever behaved best could ring the dinner bell that evening. "Secure the crossroads," Ralt ordered. "Establish this as a forward staging point." His soldiers moved into the empty buildings, and for a brief window of time, it looked to Overseer Vex, watching from orbit, like the operation was finally proceeding according to doctrine. That window closed at dusk. The Combine's main push came at dusk, exactly as Overseer Vex had planned, and exactly as Bishop Stoltzfus had guessed it would. Vex, increasingly unsettled by a full day producing no casualties, no surrenders, and no coherent tactical picture from either landing site, ordered a full company forward to link the settlement center with the primary landing zone, and in his words, demonstrate that resistance changes nothing. 22 soldiers marched down the single road connecting the two sites in tight formation, weapons hot, expecting to walk through open farmland with nothing to slow them but distance. They walked instead into Elam Yoder's gate. The lead soldier's sensors registered the timber walls as a mundane structure, low threat, and gave the order to advance through the narrowing passage without slowing. It was, by any Combine training standard, the correct call. It did not account for 4 wooden throwing arms releasing in sequence, each one hurling a stone the size of a bushel basket, with the kind of accuracy that came from men who had spent their whole lives judging weight, distance, and timing by hand and eye alone. The first stone took out the lead transport sled entirely. The second and third scattered the formation into the narrow funnel of the gate, where men with pitchforks, hay hooks, and a genuine unwillingness to be pushed off their own land were already waiting. Nobody on the Combine side had trained against an enemy that used no powered weapons at all. Their armor, built to shrug off plasma fire and kinetic rounds, had never once been tested against 40 men who understood leverage, timing, and the exact breaking point of a hinge better than the engineers who built that armor ever had. Reuben Fisher, standing near the gate with a length of chain looped over one shoulder, watched the fourth throwing arm release and let out a low whistle. "Remind me never to skip your church picnics again," he said to Jonas beside him. "We don't usually throw the potato salad this far," Jonas said, already resetting the arm. The Combine Company reached the settlement center. It simply took considerably longer and considerably fewer of them than Overseer Vex had planned for. Meanwhile, a smaller detachment attempting to bypass the gate by cutting through open pasture ran into a different kind of problem entirely. 6 soldiers, moving quietly through what their sensors had logged as unoccupied grazing land, found themselves suddenly surrounded not by armed men, but by nearly 30 horses, spooked by the strange armored figures moving through their field in the fading light, and doing what spooked horses have always done, running in tight, unpredictable and thoroughly unstoppable herds. The soldiers scattered. One was knocked flat by a startled draft horse twice his mass and considerably more motivated to be somewhere else. Another found himself pinned against a fence rail by nothing more than sheer equine indifference to his presence. Levi, the young man who'd spent the afternoon hauling lumber, watched the chaos unfold from the fence line with something close to delight. "Nobody even planned that," he said to no one in particular. "No," Amos agreed, arriving beside him with his cane, "but I won't pretend I'm sorry it happened." Overseer Vex received the reports from both engagements within minutes of each other and read them twice before speaking. "Casualty report," he said finally. Corps, visibly uncomfortable, read from the log. "No fatalities among the landing force, Overseer. Significant equipment losses. 9 soldiers require extraction due to blunt trauma. 3 transport sleds destroyed. 1 additional squad reports interference from livestock." Livestock. Large domesticated quadrupeds, Overseer, unarmed. The squad was unable to maintain formation. Vex stared at the display for a long moment, at the neat lines of timber walls his scans had dismissed as fencing, at the wooden arms his threat assessment had logged as barn framework right up until the moment they weren't, at a tactical report that now included the phrase interference from livestock, without a hint of irony anywhere in it. "They built weapons," Vex said slowly, "in a single afternoon, using tools we did not think to scan, and they defeated a second squad using animals that were not deployed as weapons at all." "It appears so, Overseer." "Why?" Corps checked the translated field reports. "The population refers to the process as a barn raising, Overseer. It is described as a routine cooperative activity. Multiple households contribute labor toward a single structure, completed in one day through coordinated effort. As for the animals, Overseer, they are simply present on every farm, at all times. They do this regularly." "For barns, Overseer, yes. The animals, Overseer, are simply how they live." Vex sat with that information for a long moment, turning it over the way a man turns over a stone he has just realized is heavier than it looks. Dresch, still monitoring the terrain map, cleared his throat carefully. "Overseer, I would note again that the adjacent settlement zone, 11 kilometers east, remains untouched. Standard technology, standard infrastructure. It may present a more conventional target." Vex did not answer immediately. When he did, His voice carried the particular weight of a commander recalculating an entire operation in real time. "Note it for future reference," he said. "Deploy the reserve unit to the settlement center. I want that crossroads fully secured before nightfall." Officer Ralt's team, holding the schoolhouse crossroads, found the reserve unit's arrival less reassuring than expected. 30 additional soldiers meant 30 additional soldiers standing in the open at a crossroads that, unbeknownst to any of them, sat directly downhill from the Baylor barn. The same barn currently sheltering 19 schoolchildren, their teacher, and a rapidly growing collection of farmers who had begun treating the barn's hayloft as an impromptu observation post. From that hayloft, Ruth Zook watched the alien soldiers gathering below through a gap in the boards and turned to the men beside her. "They're bunching up by the well," she said, "all in one spot." Jonas Baylor, who had left the gate defense to Reuben and come to check on his own farm, climbed up beside her and looked down through the same gap. "That well's got a good pulley on it," he said slowly. "Solid oak crossbeam. Held the weight of that whole barn roof for 40 years before we replaced it." "You're not thinking what I think you're thinking," Ruth said. "I'm thinking exactly what you think I'm thinking," Jonas said, "and I'm thinking we've got rope to spare." What followed was not, by any definition Overseer Vex's training recognized, a military tactic. It was, in the most literal sense, a barn door, the massive oak andiron door of the Baylor hayloft, rigged on its original pulley system and reinforced that afternoon with the same chain Reuben Fisher had hauled out from town, released from 40 feet up directly onto the gathered soldiers below. It did not need to be fast. It only needed to be heavy, and it needed to fall exactly where 30 soldiers happened to be standing in a tight, confident, entirely undefended cluster. The soldiers scattered as it fell, most of them clear in time, but the formation that had taken 20 minutes to assemble came apart in under 10 seconds, and Officer Ralt found himself shouting orders into a calm channel that suddenly had a great deal more static and a great deal less discipline behind it. Word of the crossroads engagement reached the English side of the valley almost as fast as it had reached the Amish side, though it traveled by a different route entirely. A phone call from Dan to his father's cousin, a text message forwarded 3 times, and finally a scanner radio conversation between 2 volunteer firefighters who had, until that afternoon, expected the most exciting call of their year to be a chimney fire. Fire Chief Marla Doyle arrived at the edge of the valley a little after 7 that evening with 2 engines, a rescue truck, and absolutely no idea what she was driving into, because the dispatcher's exact words had been, "Something's going on out by Bird in Hand, and it isn't a fire, but bring the trucks anyway." What she found, parked at the edge of the Yoder property with its headlights cutting through the dusk, was a scene that made her radio the station and simply say, "You're not going to believe this, and I need you to believe it anyway." Bishop Stoltzfus met her at the gate, which by that point had a fresh scorch mark along one beam, and a crew of 6 men already reinforcing the hinge with iron strap salvaged from an old wagon. "Chief Doyle," Amos said with the same unhurry. Ed courtesy he'd shown everyone that day, alien commanders included. "Appreciate you coming out." "Amos, there is a spaceship in Elam's back pasture." "There is," Amos agreed. "Are you people fighting it with a catapult?" "We're fighting it with what we had on hand," Amos said. "The catapult's just what came together first." Marla stared past him at the timber walls, the throwing arms, the men moving lumber in the fading light with the same calm efficiency they'd bring to any Saturday work frolic, and made a command decision that would later get her a great deal of good-natured grief from the county fire board, and absolutely no regrets from her personally. "Rescue truck's got a hydraulic winch on it," she said. "Floodlights too, you want them." Amos considered this for exactly as long as it took him to glance back at the gate, at the men working by lantern light, and at the darkening sky beyond the combine ship's running lights. "We'd be grateful," he said. By 8 o'clock, The Yoder gate had electric floodlights borrowed from a fire truck illuminating the work, and a hydraulic winch normally used for pulling cars out of ditches had been pressed into service, tensioning the ropes on the fourth throwing arm, tighter and more consistently than any team of men pulling by hand could manage alone. It was, Reuben Fisher observed to nobody in particular, probably the first time in the history of the valley that a fire department and a barn-raising crew had ever worked the same job side by side, and he suspected it wouldn't be the last time either community found a reason to remember it. Overseer Vex, unaware of the floodlights or the winch or the two off-duty volunteers now hauling rope beside men in plain dark coats, ordered one final push before full dark, a probing advance meant to test whether the gate's defenses could hold under sustained pressure rather than a single opening volley. 12 soldiers moved forward under covering fire from a hovering support drone, the first powered weapon the Combine had deployed all day that actually worked as intended. The drone's cannon scorched a black line across the top of the timber wall, close enough to send splinters flying and close enough that, for the first time since the ship had landed, a few of the younger men behind the wall went briefly and understandably still. Amos Stoltzfus did not go still. He walked the length of the wall at his same unhurried pace, cane tapping against the packed earth, and raised his voice just enough to carry. "Nobody's hurt," he said. "Wall's still standing, keep at it." It was not a battle cry. It did not need to be. The men behind the wall, who had spent the whole day building something with their own hands rather than waiting for someone else to defend them, took the bishop's calm as its own kind of order and kept at it. Levi, crouched near the third throwing arm with Reuben's borrowed winch cable still taut in his grip, watched the drone circle back for a second pass and made a decision nobody had told him to make. He waited until the drone was directly overhead, lined up with the tensioned arm, and released. The stone missed the drone by a wide margin. It did not miss the ground directly beneath it, and the impact, combined with the drone's own downdraft kicking loose dust and splinters across its sensor array, was enough to send it wobbling sideways into an unplanned, undignified retreat back toward the ship. "Didn't hit it," Levi admitted, a little sheepishly as Reuben clapped him on the shoulder. "Didn't need to," Reuben said. "You made it decide the sky wasn't safe. That's most of the job right there." The 12 advancing soldiers, deprived of their air cover, and facing a wall that had already proven it could stop considerably more than an unsupported infantry push, pulled back without orders to do so, which was, in its own quiet way, exactly the kind of decision Overseer Vex would spend the rest of that evening trying to understand. By full dark, Overseer Vex stood over his tactical display with the particular stillness of a commander, watching a clean plan collapse into something his training had no name for. "Full status," he said. Corps read from a report that had grown considerably longer than either of them had expected it to by this hour. "No fatalities among the landing force, Overseer. 23 soldiers require extraction. 5 transport sleds destroyed. 1 barn structure was used as an improvised projectile against the reserve unit. The crossroads position has been abandoned. Officer Rault requests immediate reinforcement or extraction." By what weapon system, again, was the barn deployed? A door, Overseer, approximately 400 kilograms, released from height using a rope and pulley mechanism original to the structure. Vex closed his eyes briefly. "They dropped a door on us." It appears the door was, in this instance, the weapon, Overseer. Dresch, standing quietly at his station, allowed himself the smallest and most carefully suppressed exhale of something that was not quite laughter and would never be officially logged as such. Vex turned to the main display. At the neat lines of timber walls his scans had dismissed as fencing at dawn. At the wooden arms his threat assessment had logged as barn framework right up until the moment they weren't. At a field report that now, somehow, included both livestock interference and an improvised door strike within the same 6-hour window. "Explain to me," Vex said slowly, "how a population with no power grid, no standing military, and no detected weapons of any kind has cost us more equipment and more casualties in a single day than the conquest of the ice colonies at Threl Minor." Kor had no answer that would improve the situation, so she gave him the honest one instead. "They do not fight like a military overseer. They fight like farmers who have simply decided today to build something other than a barn." Bishop Stoltzfus walked out to the fence line alone that evening, the way he often did after a long day of work, and found Overseer Vex already there, standing very still, looking at the timber walls that had appeared across his one road out of nowhere. "You could have gone around," Amos said, "through the fields." "Our vehicles are not suited to soft ground," Vex admitted, which was, in its own way, the first honest thing either side had said to the other all day. "And our soldiers, it seems, are not suited to your animals." "No," Amos agreed. "They wouldn't be. Ground's better with a horse, always has been." Vex looked at him for a long moment. "You built all of this in a single day. Fortifications, weapons, a coordinated defense across multiple sites without radio, without any means of rapid communication that we could detect." "We do it most Saturdays," Amos said. "Usually it's a barn. Man loses one to fire or storm, word goes out, and by evening he's got a new one. We just build for a different kind of storm today. Your species has no power grid, no standing defense force, no advanced weaponry of any kind." "No," Amos said. "We don't need much of that. We need each other and enough wood and a bit of rope, and knowing exactly who to call on and exactly what they're good at. That's most of it if you think it through." Vex considered the wall in front of him. No seams the sensors had flagged, no components that registered as anything but ordinary lumber, and yet it had stopped his best soldiers cold in under a minute. He thought of the barn door and the horses, and a crossroads abandoned not because it had been captured, but because it had simply never been worth capturing to begin with. "What do you want," Vex said finally, "for us to leave?" Amos thought about that the way he thought about most things, slowly and without hurry. "Take your ship, go on back the way you came, and next time you're passing through somebody's valley, maybe knock first." Vex looked at the timber wall a while longer. Then he looked at the fence line, and the fields beyond it, and the quiet lantern-lit farmhouses that had organized an entire fortified position without ever once raising their voices. "There is another settlement," Vex said, 11 kilometers east, modern infrastructure, powered vehicles. It would, by every measure my ship can take, be a far simpler target." Amos nodded slowly. "Might be," he said, "but I'd think on that a while before you try it. Those are our neighbors. They come to our barn raisings too, some of them, and they've got trucks." Vex did not entirely understand the warning, but something in the bishop's tone told him it was not one to dismiss lightly. "Overseer," Kor's voice came through his calm, quieter than usual. "There is something further you should see before you decide." Vex followed her to the ship's forward sensor display, where a slow-motion replay of the afternoon's engagements had been compiled, timestamp by timestamp, into a single composite view. Timber walls rising in hours, throwing arms assembled from grain hoist parts, a barn door falling with the calm, unhurried inevitability of something that had never once needed a power source to be dangerous. Floodlights arriving from an entirely separate, entirely unrelated group of humans who had simply heard there was trouble and driven toward it. "Two distinct populations," Kor said. "Different technology levels, different customs, by all our metrics almost nothing in common. And within hours of each other, they were working the same defensive line, side by side, without a single formal order passed between them that we could detect." Vex watched the footage a second time in silence. "They do not need us to have a reason to work together, Overseer," Kor said. "They simply do it. It appears to require no signal at all. Vex turned that thought over for a long moment. The way a man turns over a stone he has just realized is not a stone at all, but the corner of something buried far deeper than he had first assumed. He thought of the adjacent settlement 11 kilometers east, of trucks and radios, and the kind of population his sensors would have called, that morning, a considerably harder target. He understood now, standing on that fence line, that his sensors had been measuring the wrong thing from the very start. He gave the order to withdraw at first light. The combine ship lifted off the Yoder pasture the next morning, leaving behind 5 damaged transport sleds that Jonah's baler would later strip for parts he swore were just good scrap metal, whatever it is, and one door, considerably heavier than it looked, that took 6 men and a team of horses to haul back up to the baler hayloft where it belonged. Elam Yoder replanted the corn the following week. Bishop Stoltzfus never spoke much about that day beyond confirming, when asked, that yes, the barn raising had gone a little differently than usual, and no, he didn't expect it to happen again any time soon. Sadie Fisher's photographs never made it further than her cousin Dan's phone, mostly because nobody in the valley particularly wanted the attention, and because, as Amos put it when the question came up at the next church service, the Lord and the neighbors both know what happened here. That's about as much telling as it needs. Reuben Fisher kept coming to barn raisings after that, real ones, the ordinary kind, and never once mentioned to a customer in his hardware store exactly why he'd sold an entire valley's worth of chain and rope in a single afternoon that spring. He did, however, quietly stock a little more chain than usual from that year forward, just in case. Fire Chief Marla Doyle wrote up the call, eventually, as a mutual aid response to an unidentified structural incident, mostly because the county's official incident forms had no box for what had actually happened, and she was not about to be the one who invented it. She kept a single photograph from that night in her desk drawer at the station, timber walls lit up gold under her truck's floodlights, and a line of men in plain dark coats hauling rope alongside 2 firefighters in turnout gear, all of them pulling the same line at the same time. She never showed it to anyone outside the department. She never needed to. Everyone in that valley who mattered had already seen it happen with their own eyes. The following spring, when a real barn, Levi's father's, this time, lost to a lightning strike in a summer storm needed raising, word went out the old way, gate to gate and lantern to lantern, and by evening it had somehow also reached the fire station, unprompted, and 2 off-duty firefighters showed up in jeans instead of turnout gear, just to help carry beams. Nobody made a speech about it. Nobody needed to. It had simply become, without anyone deciding it formally, one more thing the valley did together now. The road into the valley still runs the same route it always did. The timber walls came down within a month. The wood repurposed the way everything in that valley eventually got repurposed, into a new barn roof, a new fence, a new wagon bed. Somewhere in a Scren Combine archive, a single planetary notation was filed and never revised. Population density low, technology level minimal, threat level, do not underestimate. Note, population capable of constructing effective fortifications and weaponry within hours using only hand tools and cooperative labor. Secondary note, domesticated livestock should be considered an active battlefield variable. Recommend total avoidance. Overseer Vex added one line of his own, one that wasn't required by any standard report format. They do not fight like an army, he wrote. They fight like people who have spent their whole lives building things that last, and who simply decided on this particular day to build something that wouldn't. Weeks later, in a training hall on a world 400 light-years from that valley, a young Combine officer sat through a mandatory lecture on Earth that included exactly one case study. The image on the screen was simple: a wooden gate, a stack of fresh-cut lumber, and a single elderly human standing beside it, leaning on a cane, looking directly into the camera with an expression the translation notes described only as unhurried. "This," the instructor said, "is what our records call the bird in hand incident. Study it carefully. It is the only engagement in Combine history where the enemy's entire arsenal was assembled from raw materials in under 12 hours using techniques over 3 centuries old." A cadet in the back raised a hand. "What happened to the settlement afterward?" The instructor almost smiled. "As far as our sensors could determine, cadet, they had church on Sunday, same as always." Another cadet, younger than the first, studied the image a moment longer before speaking. "Sir, if their technology level was that low, why does the file list the read level as severe rather than minimal?" The instructor pulled up a second image, the barn door mid-fall, time-stamped a fraction of a second before impact. "Because technology level was never the variable that mattered, cadet. Overseer Vex's final annotation on this file states it plainly, and I want every one of you to remember it before your first deployment. A population does not need advanced weapons to be dangerous. It needs only 2 things: the willingness to work together without being told to, and enough time in one day to prove it. This settlement had both, in abundance, and neither one showed up on a single sensor reading we took." The room was quiet for a moment. Somewhere near the back, the first cadet who'd spoken made a small note in his own log, one that was not required by any training syllabus, but that he suspected he would remember longer than most of what was. "Do not mistake simple tools for a simple enemy." He thought, too, about a second detail buried in the footage that the instructor hadn't mentioned. The moment a single young man, acting entirely on his own judgment, had turned a defensive weapon toward an aircraft nobody had trained him to fight, and driven it off not through force but through simple, correctly applied pressure at exactly the right moment. Nobody had ordered that. Nobody could have. It had simply been the right thing to do, and someone standing there had done it, the same unhurried way everything in that valley seemed to get done. The cadet closed his log and did not raise his hand again, but he kept the note, and years later, stationed on the far edge of Combine space himself, he would still remember it clearly enough to pass the same warning on to a cadet of his own. Overseer Vex himself, reassigned some months later to a considerably quieter survey division on the far side of Combine space, was occasionally asked by newer officers whether the stories about the wooden gate were exaggerated in the retelling. He always gave the same answer, delivered without a trace of humor, because none was needed. "No," he would say. "If anything, we understated it in the official report. Nobody who wasn't standing at that fence line would have believed the full account, and frankly, some days, I still have trouble believing it myself." Back in the valley, none of that mattered much. The corn grew tall that summer, same as every summer before it. The gate came down, the wood went into a new hog shed on the Yoder property, and the story got told when it got told at all, the same unhurried way everything got told in that valley, over coffee after church, to someone who'd ask what that scorch mark out past the tree line used to be from, and get an answer that was mostly true, delivered by someone who'd rather talk about the weather next. If you made it to the end of this one, drop a comment telling me what you think they'd build next time. Hit that like button, subscribe if you want more stories like this, and share it with someone who appreciates a good old-fashioned barn raising. See you in the next one.